I can see some names slowly ticking in. Hello, Daniel. Good morning. Yes, one of those.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
It is.
That's what they say.
I think I generally count 5 a.m. as being more morning than night, but it's certainly on the cusp, isn't it? It's hard to tell which one it is. Welcome to the CALEXT session, first session of the day here on Tuesday at IETF. What? Did I put the wrong date on that? I did. There you go.
That was yesterday.
That's yesterday. It's still
so many things yesterday.
It's still yesterday somewhere in the world. Right, let's move on. Nobody saw that. This is the Notewell, where I believe everyone in this room is very familiar with the Notewell, and probably everyone remotely as well. We have a small but high quality group of people here. So yes, note the Notewell. Some tips for this one. If you're in the room, please scan the QR code or pop into the data tracker and get online in Meet Echo somehow. That is how you get blue sheeted and how we know you are here and will allow you to speak. Because if you don't follow the process exactly, there's no speaking for you. All right, some resources, whatever. That's just on the. Hi Barry, you can talk. No, you can't. Here's the agenda. As you can see, it is long and detailed with very many documents, but we don't have to stick to this. Whoever feels like speaking, let me know. Pop up, do your thing. We have lots of time. I don't know if we'll use it all, but we might. Any other business before we hit the new charter discussion? I am seeing a lack of hands. All right, I'm going to just share.
It's not very often that you have a chair suggesting that we will be disorganized and use as much time as possible.
That's Alexei breaking protocol, not standing at the microphone, sitting drinking his tea with no mask on. Disgraceful. And giving me crap from the heckling from the back row of this room, which for those of you who are remote is 3 rows deep, so it's not very remote. All right, we have a new charter. Congratulations, everybody. We are now the maintenance working group for everything calendar, contacts, and related enough to stick itself into this pile as well. I think everyone's seen this charter. We say we're going to be maintaining the existing standards. The important thing here is that we expect everything to be backwards compatible. One thing that's come out of this is that any work on iCalendar or JS Calendar is required to update the mapping document and update the other things there. So please keep that in mind for any documents that are in progress or that we do from now on. We have to make sure we do both those formats. And I suspect that the same thing is going to happen with vCard and JS Contact as they come along, because it says with the existing standards, it doesn't specify. Well, it specifies, in fact, for those two that we expect things. But yeah, anything where we have multiple representations, we're expected to update the model and then update the representation in both. Cool. This was basically just a summary for the hundreds of people who came in to check out what's happening, and the millions who are going to watch this on YouTube when it goes viral. So welcome, everybody. Shall we move on? Excellent. Woohoo! According to the agenda, next things were the new work. No, hang on. Next thing was let me pull up my chair slides again. The work that's actually at the ISG, which is iCal Relations. Mike, did you want to say anything about this?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. I guess the only I uploaded once a small slide deck for that, and because there's only one slide for it, and there was one remaining Yeah, that's it. The next one, I think. Yeah, there's a section. There's a section where using existing link relations and whether there should be some text to say you really need to write an RFC if you're going to use existing link relations to say how you're going to use them so other people know what you're doing. There's no text as such at the moment other than to say you can use existing link relations. I'm a little uneasy about having nothing. So there was some suggestion from Benjamin suggested something of that kind at the bottom. And I guess the other question is, does this need a section on, does it need JS calendar examples? It sort of started off before, and one of the reasons for getting this moved along is because it's sort of used by the JS calendar mapping draft.
Hey, Michael, don't we get to see your face?
Oh, 5 in the morning.
There's no law that says you have to show your face.
Yeah, I'll show my face for a short while. There you are. Hi there.
Good morning. Hello.
So they're the two questions. I think it's pretty much done. It's sort of started before the new charter, and it's so. Do you think I should put in some JS calendar stuff, or is it going to be covered by the mapping draft?
Francesca, did you want to speak first, or because you were in the queue? Okay, go for it, Ken.
This is Ken Merchants. So, Mike, if this is going to go out the door before the mapping document, I would suggest the mapping document deal with relations itself.
That'll be good.
Yeah, I'd prefer not to hold it up as well. Francesca.
Yeah. Hi. I don't have a opinion about that, but I just wanted to mention that the ISG is changing tomorrow, so we will lose some ballots. And I was hoping to so the document is all green, which means that it could be approved, but I know we're waiting for this small update. And so I was thinking of changing its status to approved, announcement to be sent, revised ID needed, to freeze the fact that it's approved, but small changes are required. So there is nodding. So yeah, I will do that so we don't lose the ballots. It should still be enough ballots, but yeah, never know.
Great. Yeah. I mean, it's only a minor change anyway, so I think it doesn't really change the any of the specification. It could be considered editorial, I guess.
Hey, this is Robert speaking. So in terms of link relations, I see that we are currently doing duplicate work for defining link relations, both in the JS calendar iCalendar mapping document and in the in this draft. So we should certainly just make sure that we're using one of these options and not introducing two options to do the same thing, basically. We might come back to this discussion when we discuss the JS calendar iCalendar mapping draft, though?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just putting the notes in there. All right, so I think everything's agreed on this. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah. So basically, there is one thing we don't have to do in that document, which is the document in JS calendar.
Yeah, so we decided that because the JS calendar iCalendar mapping document's not done yet, that we'd document it in that one for this draft rather than the other way around, because this one's going to go through first.
So this one is almost baked.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you think, Mike? Do you think you will be able to do that this week, for example?
Yeah, I think. I mean, this is the only. It's really just adding this one sentence to the text, and it could just be left as part of the editorial process. So I think it's pretty much done. It's really this only this one question.
So okay, good. So let's aim. Let's target that this draft is going to be done by this week.
Yeah, I was gonna put some text in there last night, but I thought I may as well leave it till we'd at least had a chance to talk about it.
Okay, good.
Awesome. So Francesca's going to approve it. Mike's going to add the text, and we're done. Fantastic. Yep. All right, and Mike, you had one more slide.
Yeah, I thought I could do the subscription upgrade. I took another look at this, and I think actually it's pretty much ready. I did see, as I say here, that I was referring to the wrong spec. This has some link relations, uses link relations as well. So I need to update it to reference the right spec. And I did also notice that somehow the privacy section had got its header screwed up, so it got tagged onto the end of the security section. But apart from that, it looks pretty much. We've had a certain amount of discussion about it already online, and this is another one I think which is pretty much done.
Cool. So does this sound like you push a new copy with that fixed and I do a working group last call on it?
That's where I think we're at, yes. And I can probably get that done as well in the next 2-3 days.
Fantastic. Well, we're making good progress then. Thanks, Mike. All right, next on our list, let's do one of the JS contact things. So I'll pop up Robert's slides. Hey. Oh wow, that is fancy. Robert's just hacked together the thing we've got in the bigger rooms where there's a TV in front of him by putting his laptop on a chair. For those of you who can't see, I'll take a photo of this little operation. Beautiful. Mostly just a Barry, but.
All right, so let's discuss JS Contact and the JS Contact vCard mapping drafts together. Next slides, please. So yeah, both of these drafts are now adopted by CALEXT, which is a great thing because now we can make sure to be better aligned also with the existing vCard and iCalendar vCard drafts. The main open item that we had at the last session was that we were discussing options how to define gender-related properties within JS Contact, scoped to the use case of knowing how to address a contact. So we were not keen on reproducing the gender property definition of vCard, which in our understanding is not appropriate for use in terms of it defined the biological sex, and it defined a free text for gender, and both understanding current gender studies advancements are not really appropriate to either knowing how to address a person in languages that require a grammatical gender, and also a free text for gender was not deemed to be the right approach, and we are waiting for defining gender identities, we are waiting for people who have knowledge in this area to come up with an additional proposal, but that's not going to be part of the core JS context specification. What we did define was a new property called speak to as. The speak to as property is scoped to define the grammatical gender, and it allows a free text field for pronouns, typically used in English like they/them, but it's really up to the user to enter whatever they want there. There is no, this also means that it's more informative to the people looking at the card. It's not that useful for machines to like it's not that easy then to use this information in an automated way in any situations, but this is what we've seen in other proprietary formats being used as well. For example, the Google People API also uses a free text field only, and we figured we go with that. Yesterday there were two discussions. So basically we didn't see any further discussion on JS Contact, but yesterday two topics were brought up, and I will be happy to discuss them here now. One is around and these concern context and label properties in contact resources. But before we go into this discussion, then our next step is really Interop testing. So Mario, the co-author, who's in the chat, has an existing implementation. I'm working on an implementation at Fastmail, and I understand that also other vendors, Rodrigo, for example, have their already have an experimental implementation. So that's going along well, in my understanding. And we target for working group last call before or at the next IETF in Philly. Next slide, please. The topics that came up very recently is one is the context property. So at a couple of places in the JS contact properties, we have specific object types, say for telephone numbers, for online accounts, for email addresses, and all these have share a property which is called contexts, which allows to define in which context this contact method should be used. So the example I've been giving here, you can have a phone number, you can say this should be used for work-related stuff or for private stuff. At the moment, we only have work and private. If I recall correctly, we originally also had the value other, but in one of the latest versions, I removed all mentions of any enum value that was called other, because it doesn't tell anything at all. So I now came to understand that some address book applications still use this, like using a generic value if there is really not much known else about it. I do not think we should do that in JS Contact, but I'm open for discussion what the benefits of allowing like a catch-all value would be. The options that are on the table, of course, are to extend the enum, which would then also go through a IANA, at least for the ones that we don't define in the core spec. Or if we really should just allow a free text value with the benefit of being that people are really able to put in whatever they want, but of course that might degrade interoperability. So I don't know if there are opinions around here.
Alexei, did you want to pop up? You're in the queue.
Yeah, hello, Alexei Malikov. Good question. What are the other values that people do want to use it for, other than work and private?
Yeah, that's the main question. At the moment, I don't know.
Okay,
that's why we
all right.
restricted it to work and private. If there are other use cases, of course we can add them to the spec now. But maybe we will never be able to to identify all situations. And so the question then is, should we expect implementers to register the new enum at IANA, or should we just allow to put in everything? Personally, I lean towards defining an enum with restricted values, because then we can define semantics for each of the enum values.
Yeah, I would like to try to find out what people using other for at the moment.
Yeah.
Is it because like we can add the IANA registry, but if it's unclear whether it will ever be extended, what's the point? And you can just defer it until the point when you know that you need extra values. But if you know now or suspect now that you probably will need to extend, then just do the registry. So I hope it helps.
Cool. Oh, we've got a whole list here. Yours. Okay.
Hi, I'm Joris. Yeah, for us, it's just we saw that in several systems that they are currently using other, and it might be a more generic question how to map that to JS contact. As long as the information, as long as it's possible to transfer it to JS contact and back to vcard, it doesn't necessarily need to be an official value, maybe, but just it should be mentioned somewhere in the conversion spec.
A question to that, please. So if these applications allow other, do these also allow to not set a context? So is okay. So then basically, since the context is, I think, optional in JS contact, if not, it should be, then a non-existing context would map to other in other applications, or of application formats actually.
Okay.
What of course would be very interesting is if there are contexts that we can that are scoped to some specific context. That would be really interesting. But yeah, for other, I would just say the absence of context describes it as good as yeah.
Okay. Makes sense to me.
Okay.
Barry.
This is Barry Lieba. What is the substantive difference between an enum that and any arbitrary string that has to be registered with IANA? I don't understand.
Oh no, maybe I so what I tried to say is we should register enums at IANA that can be extended, but I wouldn't say that. I mean, free texts registering at IANA doesn't make sense. So I wanted to say either it should be an extendable list of enums, but the extension must go through the regular IANA registry process of adding another value, or it should be a free text value that
at JSON level, it's going to be a string value either way.
Yeah. Right. So that's what I think the right answer is to have the context registered with IANA with specification required.
Yes, yes, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, that's
maybe I was not saying it correctly. Yeah.
And then that gives you the ability to, in the specification, to say that this is just a meaningless string or that this has the following semantics.
Yep.
And you can go either way depending on the registration, and then there's an expert reviewer.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello, this is Hans-Jörg. So maybe to shed some light on this other thing a little bit from what I know. So historically, I think it was Exchange introducing this word home other. So they just have 3 fields for addresses, for email, for everything. So that's the scheme they just have. And a lot of systems followed that approach. And then some systems came, I think maybe for instance, Google started with that, like they resolved all that and allowed you to do more than 3 email addresses, more than 3 postal addresses, and so on. And they basically came on with a more or less free-form context thing. Yeah, so you could basically define everything. So the question now, if we need in terms of together with work and home other, yeah, actually it's not really defined. It's just a legacy thing because there were just those 3 fields. Yeah? My point would be there is a lot of applications based on that a little bit because it's there for quite some time. Yeah? So that, in my opinion, would be maybe one reason to consider this as a standard field as well, because it's super established in a lot of applications already. That is for the why there is other also. I mean, there's not so much magic beyond that around it actually, and probably you won't lose so much else, but you would probably make life a little easier for people adopting JMap with existing tools because they already have this, standard model of those 3 context properties baked in. To your second question with the IANA registry, I would probably say, in my opinion, I mean, as far as I know, for instance, if you do it in Google or something like that, you can even add free-form connect properties. And I think people use it more like a keyword thing or something like that. So probably a IANA registry to do it really formally specified what a certain value means beyond these work, home, and private and other, probably over-engineer it and make it too slow as a process, because I think nobody might do the work on submitting it to IANA and something like that.
Okay.
Yep. It sounds like the biggest challenge here is going to be round tripping between a vCard that has these additional things that someone's entered and JS contact. There needs to be a way to round trip it through so they don't lose information they've added.
So there is, for every property in or any type in JS contact that has a context or contexts, actually, there is also a free text label field. And this is and that in earlier drafts we had, I think, this other context, but it basically meant if you write other in here, put the free text value or whatever you want into label, but you can still do that. So I don't think, I mean, for if there is the specific value of other, I really do not see how that would differ from not defining a context at all and just writing into the label whatever free text you want.
I don't disagree with you. I think the magic here would then be just to be very clear on that in the mapping document.
Yes,
so
yes.
that people know what to do because it's a common case, so people will want to know how to deal with it. And probably we should give them a guidance on how this is to be done in a JS context.
Yes, yes. So we need to be very clear in the
and
document.
That would be super clear, obviously, if it's in the top level spec. But I agree with you. Writing in the future something which has been weird in the past not necessarily makes it better.
All right.
Okay,
thank you.
This is kind of, again, I just wanted to say +1 to the idea of other being lack of context.
Okay, then I suggest we go to the next slide, please. Yep. Okay, and that's bringing us to the label property. So as I said before, the label is a free text value that you can assign to any contact method. It's basically meant to accommodate for the use case that in several applications you can add additional information like a free text value to a telephone number or whatever, and the expectation is that usually this will be used by applications to display to the user, so it's more informative to the user rather than informative to the implementations. However, the current JS Contact vCard mapping document uses, under some circumstances, the label property to contain information that's relevant for mapping between JS Calendar and iCalendar. So notably, if you have a CalURI property in vCard that defines the calendar address for this contact, then that's currently mapped with the label property set to CalURI. Now, as you can see in this example, a resource has a type, and that's again a restricted enumeration of values, one of them being URI. So I would suggest that we not use the label property for defining any mapping related information, because that's really useful for the machine but not useful for the user. So we should rather extend the type enumeration values if URI is too generic to convey the specific type of URI or the context where it's used. The alternative would be a subtype property, but that might go too far in my opinion. However, this shows that there is the necessity, since we are mapping a couple of vCard of distinct vcard properties into the same object type in JS Calendar, and using the label in the current mapping document clearly shows that we are lacking a way to convey to keep the information which property was mapped to where. So I'd rather suggest we look into defining a general scheme where we can define for these situations which property mapped to where. This could be an extension property on the JS Calendar object type. Sorry, the JS contact object type, which like tells, okay, I came from this vcard property, or probably we come up with other schemes. But I would set, I would not use free text values to use that, especially not something that's shown to the user. Any opinions on that?
I strongly agree. Keep the user and the structure separate. User data and structure separate.
Okay, so what it shows that we are lacking this this way to keep information for the mapping, and this we have the exact same situation in JS Calendar anyway. So at the best, we can come up with a scheme that's appropriate for both mappings. And I highly insist that we should use one scheme for both formats. All right, that's the last slide. Are there any topics to discuss in terms of JS Contact? In the queue? Nope.
Nobody's in the queue.
All right, so then I'd say that's it for JS Contact.
Cool. So you already said up front that the plan is to have it ready for working group last call by next IETF. Are there any other intermediate steps we should be tracking along the way?
I mean, the next important step is to do interop testing. I don't know if that should be a step within IETF that we should track.
There's also a virtual CalConnect coming up somewhere in between, isn't there? So.
Yes, I think that's next month already, so we might not be ready to do that though.
Cool.
It's May. Okay, that could work. So are we going to do an interim then at CalConnect?
We probably will do an interim meeting at CalConnect, yeah.
Okay.
We normally do.
Great.
Cool. All right, thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Let's see. We were going to maybe do some more of Mike's stuff just so that we don't have all the same person all the same time. So let's maybe skip ahead in the agenda to, what have we got there? Tasks. Now, Mike, I can hand you control of the slides if you like. You should now be able to drive it yourself.
Oh, what? Arrows?
Yep.
Let me try that. Nothing's happening. Oh, it did happen.
There you go.
Amazing. Technology.
Isn't that great?
So, when we were originally putting this spec together, we were still frightened of using new components for some reason. And I was taking a look through it once I resurrected this thing, and realized that a lot of the stuff we'd done was to try and group properties together. So you could actually express more information about something, and in particular, it was adding more information about status and and attendees, essentially actors in a task. So I decided to invent a vStatus component, which would should encapsulate information about a status, and probably the three main things is to have that would go within a vStatus are the current status property, most likely a comment, because that's what it was largely about, is what happened, why did the status change or whatever, and a date stamp. There could be other properties, but those are the main ones that we were trying to group together. The idea with this all these updates was originally to try and express things that go on in processes, and tracking the state. In particular interest for the other author was obviously because he's DHL was tracking packages and things of that kind through a system. So I actually added a vStatus property to the last one I published, and this is largely what is likely to change as a result, and mostly it's simplification. Did I jump 2 there? No, I didn't jump. We had a reason parameter, which was indicated why there was a change in status. So that could be a new property. I was sort of toying in my mind over the last couple of days, would that just be a summary, or could we actually have a new reason property? For tying these things together with an attendee, I think the thing to use there is the participant component, and what was the event pub draft, and I can't remember our new RFC, which defines the participant component, has a way of tying it to the attendee, so you can sort of add metadata about attendees that's already covered. So if we invent a new reason property, which should just be free text, I think that covers what was being done in this draft. It's certainly simpler in process, in concept. I did wonder whether summary meant the same thing, but I don't think it's quite the same thing. And we had a modified parameter, which really is just the DT stamp, so that would disappear. There seems to be there's a delay, or I don't know. Here we go. And in the text of the thing, it defines the idea of a substate parameter, and has some text around that. I think again that would just be turned into a property which would go inside the vStatus. Seems to take 2 presses. The attendee changes. Yeah, these are just. I mean, there's so many slides because these are partly my noting this stuff down as I went through the thing. Again, as I said, with attendee, we just use the participant component and shove everything inside that, which means we can get rid of this group parameter that we invented. There we go. We had some changes. Section 14.2 was changes to comment, which to add some of the bits and pieces that were involved with grouping. We don't need that anymore, so that section would just disappear this way. Again, another section that would drop. And that was a quick first pass that I shoved in there before I put it to see what it looks like. It'll need some updating to add the reason property, but apart from that, it greatly simplifies the spec. And the other question was, do we need to do a vCalendar mapping? Because some of this JS calendar mapping, some of this stuff is referred to in the JS calendar mapping. So that was another reason I was trying to get this thing moved along for that. And Almost seems to take 2 button presses to get something to happen. Or maybe I've hit the end. Maybe that's the end. So that's where my thoughts were going. It's adding the V status just seems to make things a lot cleaner and simpler.
All right, Ken, did you want to pop up?
This is Ken again. Yes, yeah. So Mike, if my recollection is correct, a lot of those parameters were just mirroring properties at a per attendee basis, correct?
Well, they were largely to try. There was the thing I wanted to try and get rid of was that group parameter, which is to try and group things together.
Yep, understood.
We just don't.
Yep. Basically, I was just going to say I'm all in favor of moving these per participant parameters into properties within participant itself, and same thing with V status. As far as where to put the mapping, my gut is we're gonna have some churn on this draft. So my gut is to put the mapping in this draft and pull it out of what Robert's currently working on, or you and Robert are currently working on. So at least we have a example of how future specs need to include a mapping. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And that's why I asked the question. The relations draft is so far along, it didn't seem to make sense there. But this one is not quite that far.
Right.
So I'm happy to add a section on.
So I'm not sure what mapping the draft currently discussed would include for participant. Is the idea that it defines all the mapping for the participant, or just the parts that are relevant to this draft?
Probably parts that are relevant. I think what's going to happen. This is going to run in parallel with what we're doing with the JS calendar mapping. So we can probably work out exactly what goes where as we do the two specs.
Yeah, that is what I would appreciate, and I would rather say the general mapping of the participant component to JS calendar and the other way around should be in the JS calendar iCalendar draft that we are working on, because I think there should be one document that explains how the existing RFC 8984 can be mapped to iCalendar and the other way around, and any extension to that then should go into other drafts.
Yeah, my concern when I started on work with the JS calendar mapping was I realized that we had something that was related to this spec, and I didn't want to see us end up hanging around waiting for this spec or having to pull stuff out. So I think they're going to move along together. We'll figure out any.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to avoid is that the mapping introduced in the iCal.js format translation some complexity, so that when we read the main document, we don't really understand where this complexity comes from. So, but that's the only thing I'd like to avoid. But a lot of a lot of the reference should be from the main document, which is the iCal.js. But I suppose we will still have some small adaptation or things like that in that document, in the task document.
Yeah, I would like to see us reach a point fairly soon where we have everything in JS calendar representable in iCalendar and vice versa, and this document's certainly part of that. And then get to the point where all new documents just define both, and we don't have a separate mapping stage happening. So the question really is, how many documents do we need to complete that we reach that milestone where everything's representable in both? So I don't really care which document each thing goes in, but it may even be more sensible for this one to not mention the DJS calendar at all, and have the mapping document be the one place that gives us that baseline.
Yeah, I think that'll come clear as we work through the things. But I mean, it's only the only thing. It might make sense to have the show how the V status component is mapped in this spec, but we can make that decision down the road.
Cool. All right, thanks, Mike. Anything else on this document? What's our expected next step timing here?
I think that the first thing I can do is make those changes I outlined. Is drop the group and modified parameters and add a reason property and then redo the spec along those lines, which shouldn't take very long. And I could publish that draft, and then we can move from there.
I'm keen not to load you with too many tasks, all of which then take longer because we don't have an ordering on them. So I guess
so far they're all relatively quick and easy things. So at the very least, I should get this out.
Cool. All right.
So just one thing is that we have the explanation of how to move from VCAR to GS, VTask to GS task. The other thing is that we do have a GS example in the document. And I think it's also good that someone that is only considering JSON is able to start from that document as well. So if we have at least an example or something tangible, I think that would be great to have.
Cool. All right, looking back at the agenda, we've moved through very fast so far. We're 47 minutes in. We've done the JS contact work. We've got JS calendar, iCalendar still to go. And then there was iCalendar series and server-side subscription and vPoll are drafts in progress, but I don't think we have slides for all of those, so we might skim over the remaining ones at the end. Under that slide, put up the JS calendar, iCalendar.
All right, so yeah, like the previous discussions already have shown, we quite have the need for finally defining on how to map the RFC 8984 to iCalendar. And that it's not being done is to a good part also on me, that I didn't have the bandwidth to work on it, but it clearly showed in the last weeks, already months actually, that it's that we really should get this now out of the door as soon as possible, and that's now my top priority to do. Next slide, please. So before going to the mapping, we have an errata for 8984. I think I covered it on the next slide. We have implementations, experimental implementations of the mapping in Cyrus IMAP and BDWork. In Cyrus IMAP, we actually have two mappings. The one that proprietary mapping using lots of X properties in iCalendar. That's very stable, but of course not the thing we want to keep for the future. And there is an experimental mapping that's not yet complete that I'm working on. I do have the plan to implement the standard mapping outside of Cyrus IMAP and if the libical project agrees to integrate it directly in there. This should make it also possible for other applications that are building on libical to use the mapping out of the box. For the mapping, we now have a better understanding on where the formats are lacking to map in one or the other direction, and I'm going to present quite a number of properties that we want to introduce for either iCalendar or JS Calendar today. Apart from that, we do have the need to still then decide on how to map properties for which we have no specific mapping defined. Mainly that's going to be the X properties that we might see in iCalendar, and the equivalent of those are the vendored properties in the vendor extension properties in JS Calendar, which look like a domain name controlled by that vendor / and then the property name. We definitely need to come up with something to map these, and that's also what has been discussed before already shortly for vCard, where we have the exact same need. Next slide, please. So the errata, very shortly, there was a mistake in the definition of, so let me step one step back. So by default, a JS event, the properties of a JS event all are visible, but one can define a JS event to be private, in which case only a subset of the properties are visible. Namely, there is no information included which conveys the contexts or meanings of this event. It's more that you know when it happens, but you don't know very much more than that. And there is a list of properties that can be shown for private events, but there was the mistake that we didn't include all recurrence-related properties, and we now added the errata to include all recurrence properties, so that if it's a recurring event, the implementation that looks at the private event can still know for all occurrences when they are occurring. The second errata that we filed is also related to recurrences. We mistakenly constrained that events that have a recurrence ID set, so which are an instance of a recurring event, must have a recurrence ID time zone set, but that's wrong, because an occurrence, an instance of a recurring event in floating time still is in floating time. There is no time zone bound to that. So these are, I don't know about this exact status of these, if they are like accepted already, or yeah.
Yes, they are verified.
Okay.
Name. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Any comments on the errata? I guess not. So then next slide, please. All right. And this brings me now to a couple of property definitions that we would want to discuss that have been shown to be lacking currently in the JS Calendar iCalendar mapping. So the first thing is the Geoproperty in iCalendar. The Geoproperty in iCalendar is defined to be two float values specifying latitude and longitude separated by a semicolon. However, in JS Calendar, we set the Geoproperty to a geo URI defined in RFC 5870, and this is much richer information about the geolocation. So what we propose is that we extend the value types allowed for the Geoproperty to be a URI restricted to a geo URI. The alternative would be to do not extend the value type of a Geoproperty and keep it with the two floats, but add the high fidelity resolution in the alt-rep parameter. However, it seems better to us to extend the value type, which breaks backward compatibility with implementations, than having two probably conflicting values in parameter and value of the property.
Yeah.
URI.
Ooh. You all right there? It's to stop people sitting in the back row. There's all these seats.
So this is Jörg. So it's basically a question if I understood it correctly. So what you propose is in order to have the mapping set up to retrospectively modify the iCalendar spec in order to be able to use a more rich geo-representation within iCalendar, right?
Yes, that's the plan. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I would have a little bit the concern you raised by yourself with respect to backwards compatibility. And my question would be, isn't it just possible to, derive the value for that legacy Geoproperty within iCalendar from that more rich presentation?
Yeah, that direction works. The other direction won't.
Okay, so that's, why is it so?
For example, if you look at the example on the slide for the downwards for the URI, the geo URI, you see it has latitude and longitude. What you don't see in the example, it could also have altitude, so it's already one dimension more. It also allows to explicitly define the coordinate reference system, that's the CRS parameter. And it also, for example, allows to set the uncertainty. So it's like a 40, that's actually the address of a church in Vienna, which has like a 40-meter radius.
But would it be allowed to leave these parameters away, or is it specified in that?
Yeah, I think they're optional.
Okay.
Because yes, they're optional. But how would we preserve them then in iCalendar? So
yeah, okay, you would lose them. You're right. Okay.
This is Barry. The problem with, you can add another parameter, another field, whatever, that lets you specify the richer information. I don't think it's worth it. I think it's better to break the backward compatibility in this case. Yeah.
I have to, sorry, Alex, just for I have to say the Geoproperty rarely is used anyway. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I'm also in favor of URIs. That seems just. It's also the way you extend it is a generic way you extend other properties. So I mean, it's kind of in spirit of original format, right? So.
Yep.
As far as I think saying that it has to be geo URI is probably fine, but maybe not saying completely that nothing else can ever be used there, in the sense of who knows, maybe somebody invents a better URI representation for this.
So in the JS calendar spec, we currently require a geo URI. So if we allow here generic URIs, we would need to also define that in the other spec. So maybe, yeah, sorry.
I think geo.
Okay.
All right. That was Barry saying think geo from his seat, by the way, for those of you who are remote.
Okay, Hans-Jörg, final remark to that. Being a little bit of the devil's advocate, so since you're arguing not so many people are using it anyway, yeah? So why, doing the effort of, even improving it in a way? I mean,
well, I think if we do that, it might get even used more than it currently is. For example, Apple have a X property, X Apple structural location, which basically is like when you use their clients and you select, you enter an address and it picks it on the Apple maps. That's going to be a geo URI in the X Apple structured location. So
okay, fair point.
I've put myself in the queue here because I have a question upper layer here. This document is currently slated to be an informational draft. So if we are planning to update anything in iCalendar, we might need to do a proposed standard level document defining those changes to iCalendar as a separate document. So is that the intention here to do an iCalendar
I think we
update?
even had already agreed earlier that it should be a standard document, so maybe I just didn't update the document properly.
Okay, so is the mapping document going to be a standard document in that case then, or are we going to do one that's just an iCalendar update and then build the mapping document? Cool.
This is Barry, being as I'm Yeah, being as I'm in the queue, I'll comment on that. I think it should be standard track. The other thing about usage of the field is that if we had this more detailed information, I would make more use of it. So I can support that what Robert just said, because well, for instance, I don't want to put my home address in my V card, but if I could use the uncertainty, I would be happy to put it in with a broad level of uncertainty that just got it into my town without giving me the specific address. So
just to specify, this is for calendar event information, but we might discuss the same thing for
same,
I know what you mean.
Same with both. Yeah.
All right, so then let's say we go to the next property, please. Which is the Chainmap ID property and parameter. So the Chainmap core specifications defines the ID type, and the ID type is restricted to base 64 URL characters with a maximum length of 255 octets. And we currently do not have a standard way to preserve these in iCalendar. iCalendar has the notion of using UIDs typically for unique identifiers, but the UID property is defined as a UTF-8 text value of any length and any characters. So, and we typically see these also being non-Chainmap ID strings in practice. So a couple of implementations, for example, append to each UID, they append their domain. If you're looking at the vCalendar from IETF for this session, for example, we will see that it's like IETF113, and then like it's a safe ID, but it's like a semantic ID. So we are going to need a way to keep the Chainmap ID, which typically are always only scoped within a Chainmap object. Like if you have 3 locations, they could be called location 1, location 2, location 3 in a JS event. So we want to preserve these. And the suggestion is that we introduce both properties and parameters that have this exact same requirements as a Chainmap core specification. And for example, as you see in the example, this is coming from an idea how to map this to a vLocation. A vLocation in iCalendar has a UID property. We would just tack on the Chainmap ID as a parameter under the UID, which also allows us and the idea, for example, is if the UID would be a safe Chainmap ID, then we could just omit this parameter at all and just use the UID and the other way around. Any thoughts to that? All right. So then next, please. All right, the content ID parameter. So in JS events or JS calendar objects, it's also JS task, we have link objects. A link is basically an attachment to this JS event, for example. In JS events, we allow the text description of a JS event to not only be plain text, but also to be HTML or any subtype of the text MIME type, actually. Especially for HTML, though, we try to replicate in JS Calendar what's being done in MIME messages with content IDs, so that you can in an HTML text can reference an attachment by content ID to embed in the HTML. And for JS Calendar, the idea is that the application does that, looks up in the links the content ID of the one referenced in the HTML description. For that, we propose to introduce the content ID parameter, which follows the exact same semantics as defined for the CID scheme in the respective RFC. Yeah, and we suggest to allow this to be attached to attach and image properties. Mike, I'm not sure if that should also go on a link property. Probably, I don't know. Up to you.
No, I'd have to look at the spec and think about it.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Great. So then continue, please.
Cool.
Yeah.
Alexi and I will probably be coming along and trying to tack a digest in here as well with our large file thing, so that you can have a URL and a digest. So you can say, fetch it from over here, but here's what it should be.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect.
All right, and that brings us to what has been brought up already in the relations draft, where I said we might risk duplicate work here. So again, the link object in a JS calendar object has a rel parameter, which is restricted to the same IANA registered link relations that are currently used in HTML contexts. So the link relation parameter that we propose here is again attached to an attach or image property to keep that information. I do see that the link rel parameter that you introduced, Mike, in the relations document allows for more. It also allows the value to be a URI or the hard-coded value source. So I do not know how we best handle that. If we go with the link rel definition, which could be perfectly fine, we would need to update the JS calendar link object that the rel values are not restricted only to the registry defined in 8288. But I do not know if that's appropriate, because the source string value relation seems to be very explicitly defined that the link is the event that this relation is linking to, but that's not something one would store in a link relation in JS calendar. So I see that there might be some semantics for the link rel parameter that wouldn't be covered by the current JS calendar rel. I don't know how we should address this.
I mean, the point of the link relations is they point to metadata about the object that's doing the pointing. So in this case, this is just adding a link relation which says this is where the event was derived from. This is the source of the event. It's a particular kind of relationship. And if you look through all the link relations, they're all like that. And in fact, 8288 is where it defines the idea of using a URI. That's for unregistered link relations.
So isn't that covered by the related to property in JS calendar? And likewise, I think
No, related to point very specifically used UIDs.
Yeah, but yeah, please.
Yes, you could. I mean, if we'd started all over again from scratch, we probably wouldn't have had a related to property. We would have had just link relations, and perhaps extended that enough to do what related to does. But related to exists. Already did, but
so could it be that we are just using the same words for different things then? In the meaning that yeah.
I very explicitly said in relation to draft that you don't use a link relation to handle what we treat as attachments now, specifically because attachments are are not metadata as such. They're just they're a bunch of data like the agenda or something like that attached to the event. And there's this whole thing about managed attachments which sort of puts them on a different level.
Okay, so
and I don't know how that's going to be. I mean, the question is how that's going to work in JS Calendar. What happens if you have a huge object pointed to by a link?
yeah, so it sounds to me as if the link property and the link rel parameter defined in the iCal relations draft is something that might be currently missing in JS Calendar, so that we might need to introduce new properties to the JS Calendar as part of publishing the iCal relations draft, probably. And we might then need to figure out if the link rel parameter should get another name, because it obviously means something else than the link relation parameter proposed here, right? I mean, the alternative would be to define just the link rel or the link relation parameter, whatever the name then is, with the value types that is required for the relations, iCal relations RFC, but restricting the values that make sense for a JS Calendar link object to the ones defined at IANA for, I say, actual link relations in the meaning of what RFC 8288.
Well, isn't that what the JS Calendar spec says now? I thought the JS Calendar.
Yes, the JS Calendar spec currently defines for link object for the rel property to be restricted to the values defined by the link relations RFC, the 8288.
I think that's exactly what link rel is in the relations draft.
No, I see that in the draft it defines also it allows the values of 8288, but it also allows the value to be a new URI or to be the hard-coded string source. If I misread
the source. The source is registering a new value with 8288.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
That's all it's doing. It's just registering a new value.
Okay, great. Then that solves that. So the only remaining value not covered in JS Calendar for rel would be a generic URI.
And I think I'd have to look back at 8288, but I think in 8288 that's how it recommends you specify an unregistered link relation.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, I was pretty much following the 8288 spec.
Okay, then I might have seen an issue that is not an issue. So in any case, we should just introduce one parameter and not have two doing the same thing.
Yeah, the link rel parameter could be used elsewhere.
Yes.
It's just that I think we need to look at how this is going to work with things like managed attachments.
Okay.
And that's more a matter of looking back at JS Calendar, I guess, because that sort of got ignored. In that there's no special attachment, object. So how do you figure out that you need to actually manage it?
Yes, agreed. So if the link rel parameter then comes with the iCal, if the iCal relations document is published sooner than the JS Calendar iCalendar mapping, then
we just use the link rel.
We could just use this one for the mapping. Then.
Yeah.
Neil's in the queue. Neil, do you want to speak?
Yeah. Oh, I've got echo again. For links that are attachments, I think we say in the spec that's only if rel equals attach.
Okay.
Sorry, rel of enclosure. I've got the spec in front of me now. Links with a rel of enclosure must be considered by the client to be attachments. So specifically that
Okay.
kind of link.
All right. That then we probably should say, we probably should have said something about managed attachments.
Well, JMap calendars will talk about managed attachments, but JS calendar can't because it's just the data format.
Yeah, that's true enough. Yeah. Okay. It's in that case, it sounds like it's gonna be possible to cover it.
Okay, great. So in my understanding, if ever there has been an issue, it's solved now anyway. So let's continue to the next slide, please. Yeah. So they're related to property that we have already in iCalendar. In JS Calendar, we have a location object type, and the location object type can also define if it relates to the start or end of the embedding object, that being either an event or a task. So an option would be that we extend the allowed values for the related property to also allow these to define temporal relations in the related to property, and that would be start or end. That would map cleanly to JS Calendar. The alternative thought could be if one could define any temporal relation in between start and end too. That would then deviate from what's currently defined in JS Calendar. But it might, if there is the need to define for a location that it relates to some time in between the start and the end of the event. If you have like, I don't know how to say in English, like a Schnitzeljagd, like if you are like running around and collecting clues for a puzzle you have to solve or whatever. We didn't cover that in JS Calendar. We mainly introduced the relation to allow an end relation to be set on a location, because that would be the time zone identifier of the DTN property in iCalendar. But the question now is, should we just introduce start and end, or should we extend the definition right now? I don't.
This is only for locations, isn't it?
That's only for locations, yes.
I'm more inclined to define a new property to go inside a V location. I mean, it just seems a bit odd to extend related to just for this particular case. It just seems like a property with a value of start or end or something else that you wanted to have.
Yeah, works equally fine for me. I think we had discussed this a couple of weeks ago to go with related to, but I'm equally fine to just introduce a new property.
Yeah, I think it's simpler, and it seems odd to complicate related to for this one case.
All right, that works for me. And then we are going to restrict it to the exact values that we also allow in JS Calendar, so that should be straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, and that's bringing up a specific question that then might later be discussed as a generic question. So with the vLocation component and the participant component in iCalendar having a UID, we might need to introduce the UID property also on the location participant objects in JS Calendar. These would be optional in JS Calendar, and if one would map from JS Calendar location to iCalendar where there is no UID defined by the client, the implementation would just generate a UID that it from then on uses for both. Are there any, and the generic question will come up very soon on the slides later, is how we can typically map properties for which we already have a well-defined mapping to JS calendar, but in other contexts. For example, we already have a UID property in JS calendar defined for the main, for the event and the task. And this the question came up during work on the mapping document, how we should deal with. Well, let me get back to this then. So first of all, are there any specific points to discuss for UID in this context?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, is this meant to be an ID that's consistent if you have, say, a location in one event and a location in another event? So you know that they are the same?
Yeah, so the UID property in iCalendar is defined to mean a globally unique ID. So in that sense, yes. If
I'm just trying to check how this is different to the ID in like the locations object in JS Calendar, because it's a map of ID to location object.
So in JS Calendar, the ID that we use in the map of all locations within that V event, the ID only needs to be unique within that locations property.
Yep.
Whereas a UID property in iCalendar is meant to be globally unique. So they cover different scopes. And so, yes, one would expect a UID property of location for the same location to be the same. If that's really done in practice, I would very much doubt. But it's.
I guess then you could map it to just the ID in JS Calendar. Like obviously a UID is already a valid ID.
Yeah, we can't do that in all cases because the UID might contain characters that are not a valid Chainmap ID.
Sure, but you could define a consistent mapping.
I mean, I guess you could take a digest that's always short enough. You can't guarantee a two-way mapping because the UID might also be longer than 255 characters.
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't know if, because we discussed that the IDs in a JS calendar event should persist in the same JS calendar object instance at least. So I don't know if applications are going to have their own idea what IDs they generate, which might not necessarily then map to might not necessarily would be a good choice for a UID property because it might just not be unique enough or something like that. So if we keep them separate, I think we have the least friction when mapping between iCalendar and JS Calendar.
Ken.
This is Ken. So I forget what the current spec is. What are we doing when a V-alarm has a UID property? How are we mapping that into the alerts? And if we already do that, we should just use the same mechanism.
Well, for V-alarms, the thing is, an alert in JS Calendar is not as sophisticated as it is in V-alarm, and I do not think that we currently preserve the UID, that there is the need to preserve the UID at all. We might need to, I need to check our implementation, what we're doing, but I can't recall that there is a UID property in an alert currently.
Yeah, in order to round trip this, you could have snoozed VR alarms that refer to the main alarm by UID. So I think we'd want to preserve that.
Yeah, we should. To be very honest, I don't know at the moment.
Fair enough. Just wanted to raise the question.
Yeah.
And if we choose this mechanism or something different for alerts, we should use the same mechanism across because the iCalendar currently, any different component should have its own UID.
Yes.
So those are going to be mapped some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean that's. Sorry.
Please go ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say, I was just trying to recall a conversation of way back when Cyrus was trying stuff, and he said he basically expressed the opinion that he wishes we'd always put UIDs inside components because that's why they added it to the alarm, because of the difficulty of identifying things. So that's why these new components have a UID property, because we've found in practice it's better to have one.
Yeah, and this discussion leads already kind of to the next discussion point, I think. But if we scope it just to UID, the more we introduce iCalendar components that are that have a mapping to a JS calendar object type, be that a location, a link, a participant, whatever, we will always need UIDs or also for VAlarms. So the question then remains: should we define the UID property explicitly for all these object types, or should there rather be allowed to be a UID set on any JS calendar type? Probably, Ron, if you could show the next slide, please. I think that already. Maybe you can skip this slide and then we get back to this and this, because what we would like to discuss is currently there are like different understandings how to deal with properties and component definitions in iCalendar and JS Calendar. In JS Calendar, we register at IANA an explicit list of things allowed in an object. If you want to put more in it, either register at IANA or use a vendor extension property. In iCalendar, we for almost any definition of a component, the last thing always will be IANA prop, and that means you can stuff anything anywhere in a component that's defined somewhere else. And we don't really, like, as you see with UID, for example, we now run in the situation that there might be stuff in an iCalendar object for which we didn't make room in a JS calendar object. And this is going to come up more and more, the more and more stuff we map. I would like to discuss the general options that we have to do that. Maybe on the next slide, I think I introduce a couple of approaches. Yeah, so the one thing is, whenever we see something not being able to map to a JS calendar object type, for example, the UID, we could just define it there, or the other way around, like we did with Chainmap ID. That's in a way that always will make clear what's the exact purpose of this property. The laxant version of this would be like that we define, if there is already a well-defined mapping, for example, for the DT stamp in a V event, we mapped it to an updated property in the JS event. We could say, okay, if that DT stamp shows up in a V location, then map that to an updated property of the JS calendar location object type, although the current spec doesn't allow that. No? And that still then that still doesn't cover everything, because there might still be stuff that we don't know how to map from iCalendar to JS calendar. And for this part, in any case, we need to come up with mapping that somehow preserves mapping related information. What was the source of this property? If we want to be able to always be able to convert back and forth between the two formats. And that third point is the thing that also came up before for vCard mapping, actually. So where I said we should use the same scheme, whatever we use. Mike, I think you wanted to discuss this point anyway, or are you in? Yeah. Do you? Yeah, please.
I felt that it was likely to lead to a more robust mapping process is if you recognize the property. I mean, clearly, I think your example there is, DT stamp to updated. Somewhere you're going to know that if you get a DT stamp, you're going to create a JS calendar updated property. The only thing we're talking about is whether that's supposed to be allowed within the object you're translating, and I'm inclined to just allow it and just put it in there. It just seems a bit weird to turn them all into vendor properties just because you somewhere it says you shouldn't have that in this particular object, because you're going to end up with situations where you're not keeping up with the current state of the registry, and so something will turn up with this property in it, and you won't, in your code, you won't recognize that's supposed to be in that object, but in reality it is. It's just you're out of date. It just seems more robust to allow these things to go in there. And there were places where back in iCalendar where I'm thinking of say availability, where it has this construct. It has a certain number of properties which are called out in the spec because they have some particular meaning in the context of availability, and then it says you can put anything else you like inside there, and the reason for that was that you might want to say certain things about that available time, like it has a particular location or it has some other characteristic, and restricting it didn't allow all sorts of use cases to so I just feel we shouldn't necessarily, we should just, if we have a mapping for the property, we should just do it, even if it's not in the current spec.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I agree with caveats. I mean, for metadata like created and updated, for example, or comment probably also, that makes sense to me. But somehow we need to update the JS calendar spec because it currently would reject such properties as invalid. So, and the question then is, should we define like again a well-defined list of stuff that can go anywhere?
No,
which
you
at
get the
least
same.
would contain the type of stuff that can go anywhere, or should we really allow like, okay, we just provide the generic mapping, and if it ever shows up anywhere, just put it to the appropriate place. If you don't know any better, like just for an example, if we find a geo URI in an participant, we would not map that to a coordinates property probably in a participant. We would map it to a location, and that is referenced as it currently is possible by this JS calendar participant. Then
I think there's the difference between wanting to validate an object, a calendar object or whatever, and actually just accept it so you can process it. And strict adherence to what you believe the standard to be at the time leads to problems, because you're inevitably going to get an object that is actually adhering to the spec. It's just you're not up to date with it. And somebody did raise exactly that problem on the iCal4j list, where they got a property, and because they got strict validation running on at their end, it rejected this thing because it had a property they didn't recognize, which is actually in a spec. So because of this, I mean, there are ways to avoid having to do all this stuff. If, as I was saying the other day, part of the reason for having to do this complete transformation and trying to get as complete as possible is because we have this update by replacement thing going on. If everything was done through patching and incremental updates, this probably wouldn't be as much of a problem as it is. So I'm inclined to just allow properties that you don't recognize as being part of the object, simply for robustness.
I think Neil is in the queue.
Yep, go ahead, Neil.
Sorry, if I was, that was by accident.
Yeah, that's what you've been in there for a long time.
Oh, okay.
Alexi.
I think I tend to agree with Michael that it looks like the original JS calendar restriction is not useful anymore, or at least, for interop, for, bidirectional conversions. So you need some mechanism of converting arbitrary properties. Requiring them, all of them need to be added to IANA registry before they can be converted. That's a bit, doesn't seem practical.
Yeah.
So you need some kind of variant, whether it's magic prefix like vendor extension or no extension, which is what Michael is talking about, I think. You need a generic mechanism for
I say if you recognize the property, then just convert it. If you don't, then you have to turn to some sort of vendor extension thing. Yes.
So.
Yeah, I think the distinction. Sorry to interrupt, but I think the distinction should be made between stuff where we already know a well-defined mapping, for example, for the timestamp.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand.
We certainly need this vendor extension mapping always, because there will always be stuff we don't know anything about.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is Ken. Yeah, I was going to suggest that, and Neil might throw up when he hears my suggestion, but perhaps we just come up with a JSON representation of a generic iCalendar parameter, property, and component. And for everything we don't understand, we create an object or an array of these particular things.
Yes. The idea of this vendor extension thing would actually, and it's just an idea to use JSON, of course, as a value, but use a JS-cal, so which allows like a direct mapping.
Yeah, that's what I was going. The JCal format was what I was going to suggest.
JCal's kind of ugly. I think we might want to do.
It is, but it's defined, and it saves us having to define yet another
That's fine
thing.
too. That's why I said Neil might not like my suggestion, but JCal's fine.
Yeah. So I think the open discussion point still is what to do with stuff that we could just map because we have the mapping defined already somewhere else. So in the term of we have some generic well-defined properties, as I said, off the top of my head, created, updated, command. Probably, I'm sure there is other stuff. If we need to, if we should register these all at IANA, that is the current scheme, or if we allow a generic mapping.
It's tricky because if we don't register everything up front, then you'll get implementations that do different levels of quality of mapping here.
Okay.
But if we don't register, if we don't have a specific list of things that are the ones you should map, then yeah, the question is what do you do this with and what don't you do this with? Maybe we should just say everything that's not specifically defined gets this JCal treatment, and that way everyone will have the same representations.
Yes, I think for iCalendar, JS calendar mapping, I think that's I also would like to go with that approach. That still leaves the point that Mike brought up, like that implementations currently that implement like one snapshot of the state of JS calendar RFCs would reject JS events that use properties of later RFCs.
It's the same. It's the same thing. Whether you're doing a mapping or whether you're accepting JS calendar into your system, it's if it's a recognized, if it's a known JS calendar property, when you're doing the mapping, then just convert it to that known JS calendar property, even if the spec that the other end is using doesn't recognize that as being valid within that object. You may as well just put it there. I don't think you should map that to this to some, because you're going to get the same situation if you're accepting JS calendar. The other end may be more up to date than you are.
That's what I understood you saying is that
but I don't think
any unknown property should be ignored, not rejected, right?
If you don't know about it, you just ignore it. Yes, and which is sort of what we do in iCalendar. I don't think there's a distinction between us doing the mapping, particularly, and we just do the same thing there. If you've got a property that you recognize, then map it, and the other end will ignore it.
Just saying that if you need to change the semantic from ignoring instead of rejecting unknown stuff, do it early. Do it in a draft, so hopefully whoever follows the discussion now will implement the new semantic, if it makes sense. Do it as early as possible, and then you'll figure out the exactly mapping for the rest.
So from what I gather from this here is that we won't be able to come to an agreement within this session. There are too many unknowns, and it's up to Mike and me to now write up a proposal. Well, we are writing the draft anyway already, so yeah, we should come up with something and then send to the list, or present in the interim in, when is it, in May?
Yeah, the second week of May.
Okay. Next slide, please. I think we are.
Yeah, we skipped over a couple on the way as well.
Yeah, but there are more specific mapping that doesn't need to be discussed properly.
Cool.
Probably now. Yeah. So next steps are Interop testing, and as I already wrote, we need to define how to map these new properties. What did I ask?
I'm keen to have a shared set of test cases for this that all the implementations use.
Yeah. The question I brought up here also then is if should we define separate RFCs for the iCalendar and the JS calendar extensions, or should this all go into one draft?
This is kind of, I was getting up to make a suggestion that given the fact we're going to change the mapping document from informational to standards track, and we're also extending JS calendar a little bit, and we have two errata already for JS calendar, that perhaps we refresh that at the same time we're doing the mapping and send them to the editor as a group. And then they'll have consecutive RFC numbers as well, so they're easier to find if somebody goes to use them.
Sounds good.
I raised this. I think what the other thing I suggested a few years ago, when we started talking about the geo and allowing a new URI, I was sort of favoring the idea of splitting that out into a separate RFC updating 5545, largely because it just makes it more visible, and the idea of using a URI value for the geo thing is something that is of general usefulness just in the iCalendar world. So it just seemed wrong to hide it away inside the mapping spec.
This is kind of again, I stood back up to say that if we are going to refresh JS calendar, I would volunteer to be editor on that if no one else wants to do it. I know you guys are already busy. And similarly, if we decide to split out the updating Geoproperty to take a URI, I'd also be willing to do that work, to take that off your guys' plate.
Yeah. One RFC candidate we haven't talked about in this session is we also were having the idea for allowing sub-second precision in iCalendar time values, and I recorded we agreed on having that in a separate RFC as well.
Yeah, I think so, because I did create that draft fractional thing that was based on what we'd originally talked about. But then I realized part of the problem with the whole thing is negotiation. Do you know somebody can accept fractional seconds or whatever? There is a demand for it, but it's not something that is generally needed. It's more for people doing things like process control or things of that kind. So I'm more inclined to just do that as a separate RFC, which because it touches on so many things. Is simply extend the thing so you accept fractional stuff everywhere.
Okay,
But
so
it occurs, it's recurrences and things of that kind.
yeah, I generally agree, but if we don't have that, then the conversion from JS calendar to iCalendar is probably lossy.
It will be, yeah. But you're going to break things anyway if you try and carry across all the fractional stuff. So it just seemed. I think I actually updated the spec to say you should just round it down to the nearest second.
Yep, this sounds good to me. Might still. Yeah, so then we would not be able to map.
In fact, the JS calendar spec is actually not quite fully capable of doing fractional seconds either, because there's something missing. I've forgotten what it is now.
Probably it's in the R rule. I think we don't have
something to do with recurrence IDs or
a millisecond frequency or something like that.
There's something of that, yeah.
Okay.
So just to note down what I'm hearing here, sounds like we've got 4 documents in total. We've got the sub-second time, we've got the update for Geo, and potentially a couple of other little bits and pieces for 5545. We've got a refresh of JS calendar, and we've got the JS calendar iCalendar mapping document. We're going to keep that as 4, or do we refresh JS calendar and put the mapping in it?
I don't know much about the process, what the difference between a refresh and the new RFC is.
It's new RFC, it's replacing the old one.
Ah, okay.
Forgot to check it. This is kind of again. I still think they should be separate documents personally, but I'm not going to die on that hill if the group decides otherwise.
Cool.
Well, we carry on working as if they're separate for the moment anyway.
Yeah, I tend to think that like it is between either director, working group chair, and editor. As in, if you have a preference for whatever reason, state it.
I don't have a strong preference either way. I do think that if we're going to do that, then it's probably not worth blocking tasks on having a JS calendar representation in it. We're better off doing tasks as maybe the 5th of this series of documents, which is another iCalendar update, and then do the JS calendar, keeping that in mind. And then that becomes our alignment point.
So just to be sure that we already define a JS task in the JS calendar, in the 8984 already includes the definition.
Yeah. But if we're refreshing it anyway, maybe we should do the iCalendar doc just referencing iCalendar and not referencing that, and then have our 2 JS calendar documents be the alignment point together, and then we can make sure everything's fully aligned across those documents.
Yes, that sounds very good to me.
Okay.
All right. Excellent. We have 12 minutes left in this session. Go ahead, Mike.
Really. The only thing I raised a point with Robert the other day, that the mapping document and carrying out this mapping, it depends on the context you're in, and I was suggesting we should have an initial section in the mapping document. If you're doing IMIP, the mapping can be a lot simpler, because you really don't have to have a full representation of what's in the JS calendar document, and the replies that come back in. The only thing you need to pay any attention to are the part stat and other things. So if you have, it seemed that it might be worth having an IMIP section, which would be a lot easier to do.
Yeah, so about that, I think I would prefer a separate RFC. We didn't cover the scheduling part in terms of the protocols involved at all, and I think there's still quite some stuff we need to figure out in there. So in terms of timeline, I very much would rather just define the format mapping without any protocol specific additions, because otherwise I have the fear that it will just drag on and on as a draft, and I think we should get it published, the JS calendar, iCalendar mapping, as soon as possible now.
All right. We have 10 minutes left in this session. Is there anything else on this document now, or is it keep working on it?
It's keep working on it.
Cool. Thank you. All right, popping back to our agenda. I think that's everything that I had slides for, but there were also iCalendar series, server-side subscription, and vPoll potentially to discuss. Mike, did you have anything, any progress?
Not at this stage. vPoll, I'm trying to upgrade my implementation, but I think we should just leave that one until next time. Maybe other stuff will be out of the way then, so we'll.
Cool.
This is Ken. Mike, rather than send you an email or text or what have you, I read server-side subscription and vPoll this morning. The example in server-side subscription is supposed to be a make collection example, and it's actually a post, so that just needs to be fixed.
All right.
And as far as vPoll, I don't recall the discussions about the actual poll status method, and I'm wondering why we needed a separate method as opposed to just using request to refresh the voters with the current vote. Do you recall why that is?
At this stage, no.
Yeah, because we send the initial poll out with a request. We send the final result as a request, but updating the existing voters with the current status, we have a separate method, which seems contrary to what we do with events, where we use requests for both the initial event and any updates.
Well, that's because
including just updating part stats.
I think partly because is it okay? I mean we can
certainly take this offline. It's just something to chew on.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Cool. All right, I'm going to pop up the milestones so we can have a glance through them, and then I think that will basically be all our time. All right, here's our shiny new milestones. Submit task draft to IESG. That's the first one on the list, and it was supposed to be January this year. Where do we think we're at with that?
I think so. I mean, I'll make those updates that I outlined and resubmit, possibly this week.
Cool. So put that for April. It probably is the. Let's see if I. It may be that the name has changed. Yep. All right, we'll change that. Cool. So target for April, or maybe for May actually, if we do a working group last call.
Yep.
On it nowish. It'll take about that long. All right. Good. Subscription upgrade was also going to be, that's probably even faster because that's got less work to do.
Yep.
JS calendar mapping document, that's a little way down the line, Robert. Rough estimate.
Yeah, I want to have that done for the next IETF.
All right. So July. JSON contact. Same. vPoll, we're kicking down the road. We're going to push that right out to December. Server-side subscription, kicking down the road as well. and iCalendar series we're kicking down the road. Do we have other milestones we need to add here? Almost definitely. What did we have in our document there? Yeah. Yeah, relations basically done. That is the main thing. It's JS calendar, iCalendar. All right, I'll leave that for now. And just put these ones through. I think there were errors, yes, because I added a field that I need to remove now. How do I do that? Delete, I guess. Done. All right, anything else in our last 5 minutes? I'll add a new milestone for the refresh doc once we issue that, once we send out a call for adoption on that. And I'll do a call for adoption for the geodoc and the sub-second time as well. All right, thanks everybody. See you in early May for the interim, and then in July in Philly.
Alrighty. Bye then.
Bye. Inception. All right. Oof, I've made my way through both those water bottles.
So while you guys are both here,
Yep.
EM client.
Yep.
Users creating a UV card through our UI. Create version 3 card with the UID.
Yep.
EM client pulls it down. They go to update it. They send us a V4 card with the UID changed from a text value to the URN using our UID as the URN.
All right.
And we're refusing it because technically they're changing the UID.
Yeah. They are, I'm sure, doing something dodgy there.
Well, they're